On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Dr. Robin D.G. Kelley, Distinguished Professor and Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History at UCLA. His books include Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original, Hammer and Hoe, Alabama Communists During the Great Depression, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, Race Rebels, Culture, Politics, and the Black Working Class, Your Mama's DisFunktional, Fighting the Culture Wars in Urban America, Africa Speaks, America Answers, Modern Jazz and Revolutionary Times, and forthcoming, Making a Killing, Capitalism, Cops, and the War on Black Life. He also co-edited with Colin Kaepernick and Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, Our History Has Always Been Contraband, in Defense of Black Studies. With Jesse Benjamin, Walter Rodney, The Russian Revolution, A View from the Third World, with Stephen Tuck, The Other Special Relationship, Race, Rights, and Riots in Britain and the United States, with Franklin Rosemont, Black, Brown, and Beige, Surrealist Writings from Africa and the African Diaspora, with Earl Lewis, To Make Our World Anew, A History of African Americans, and with Sidney J. Lemelle, Imagining Home, Class, Culture, and Nationalism in the African Diaspora. Dr. Kelley's articles and essays have appeared in dozens of several anthologies, journals, and magazines, including Hammer and Hope, American Quarterly, African Studies Review, Journal of American History, New Labor Forum, The Nation, New York Times, New York Review of Books, Radical History Review, Transition, Black Scholar, Dissent, Rethinking Marxism, Black Music Research Journal, Callaloo, Black Renaissance, Renaissance Noir, and the Boston Review, for which he also serves as a contributing editor. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Dr. Robin D.G. Kelley, Distinguished Professor and Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History at UCLA. How are you doing today, Dr. Kelley?
I'm doing great now that I could be on the podcast. This is like my dream for years.
That's very nice of you to say. But I definitely want to be respectful of your time, so we can dive in. So how did you get into Black Studies as a field, and what keeps you committed to doing the work of Black Studies?
Okay, that's a great question. Well, first of all, unlike a lot of people, I kind of like lived Black Studies, meaning that I was like in the history, living it, even as it was emerging as a formal field. So, I grew up early years in Harlem in the 60s, went to public schools at a time when there was like struggles over community control. I went to PS 28, actually on 155th in between Amsterdam and St. Nicholas. And I was 3 years old when Malcolm X was assassinated 8 blocks from where I lived. Or actually where I moved to. At the moment he was assassinated, we were still living in Hollis, Queens, probably not too far from where his house was. But then I lived like 8 blocks from the Audubon Ballroom. But to tell the story, I have to begin with my mother, born in Jamaica, the great-granddaughter of a Maroon, the granddaughter of Victor Rodriguez, who left Jamaica for Cuba during World War I, who was active in the Garvey movement in Cuba, had my grandmother there in Cuba. They moved back to Jamaica, and my mom ends up moving to the U.S. To live with an aunt when she's 11. This is like 1950, right? And I mentioned her, even though, I mentioned her freedom dreams, but something that I don't mention is the fact that though I'm not a red diaper baby per se, my mom's best friend in high school was Frances Beale.
Wow.
And I mean, I learned this later because she'd always talk about her friend Franny. They lived in Queens. Franny at the time, pretty much identified as a communist. And she took my mom to Camp Unity, which is one of the Communist Party camps when she was in high school. And in fact, my mom lived with Fran's family when Fran went to Paris. And for those listeners who may not know, I mean, Fran Beale founded one of the founders of the Third World Women's Alliance, She was a leader in the Black Radical Congress. She, you know, developed the concept of triple jeopardy. And she was really, really incredible person. And the funny thing is, my sister Makani Temba and I both knew Fran through political work. My really dear friend Eula Taylor, who's writing a book on Fran Beal, of course, was working with Fran, and we never made the connection that my mom's friend Franny, right, was Fran Beal until we figured it out and then got them together. Found out they were living like a mile apart from each other in the Bay Area. So it was really, really cool. And I mention that because that world that my mom created for us as a single mother in Harlem was one full of books, uh, her own absorption of those left radical politics, and the fact that we spent a lot of time going to bookstores in Harlem. I mean, Black studies to me isn't always the academy. It's like Louis Michaud's bookstore, the African National Memorial Bookstore on 125th Street, or the bookstore we went to was Liberation Bookstore on 132nd and what was then Lenox Avenue, down Malcolm X Boulevard, which was owned and operated by Una Mozak, who some of your listeners may know, Black woman, daughter of Hugh Mozak, radical socialist. She was a socialist. And in 1963, she moves to Guyana, opens a bookstore there, leads a socialist movement. She gets severely injured by a package bomb, comes back to New York, and opens up Liberation Bookstore in 1967. And by this time, it's a new bookstore for us. When we start going there, like 1968, 69, had ties to the Progressive Labor Party. And that was the space, right, for a lot of us as kids to be introduced to Black studies. It was a community where John Henrik Clark, Dr. Ben, Last Poets, members of Black Panther Party were like in the street, like in places surrounding us. And so even though I was too young to understand what they were always talking about, their very presence meant that Black studies was diffuse, right, in the community itself. We had the West Harlem Liberation School. We had the Academy for Black and Latin Education, ABLE. We had all these different sort of educational institutions that existed. And so fast forward, I'm absorbing this stuff, but I'm not that political, right? We end up in California in the late 70s. My sister, Makani Temba, who's 2 years older than me, she goes off to college, and I think 1978, she starts, politicized. She's politicized by Black studies because, you go to college, that's what happens if you're a Black person, especially in that period. And then she's telling me all these things that she's learning. And she gets involved actually in the Republic of New Africa, the PGRNA. And in the Provisional Government of Republic of New Africa, she meets and works with Akinyele Umoja. Now, some of your listeners would know Akinyele, AK, is the author of We Will Shoot Back. Brilliant book on armed self-defense, mainly in Mississippi, but elsewhere during the Civil Rights Movement. And so I was in high school when I met AK, and AK giving me literature and stuff and saying, you got to know about this. And I'm kind of semi-paying attention, right? But I'm interested in like just being cool. I start college at Long Beach State University, Cal State Long Beach, in 1980, right? And this is when the fees, we didn't really have tuition because it's a state university, but the fees were like $90 a semester, right? And I wasn't a great student, but I also wasn't dumb, not entirely dumb. And I start taking Black Studies courses, and again, it's like a thunderbolt. I get hit really hard. In Black Studies at Long Beach State, it's a decent program. It's a mixed program. One of my professors, of course, was Maulana Karenga. Took classes with him. We had some good people, had some really problematic people. We had one person who I know was a spy, but that's another story. Won't get into that. But it wasn't so much through minoring in Black studies. It wasn't the classroom. And I want to really emphasize this in terms of how I came to Black studies. It was the Black Student Union and it was independent study group. So, for example, I was recruited into the Black Student Union by, I had to look this up, but Nikki Majaliwa, who was the president at the time. We had these annual Black Consciousness conferences. And I went to the first one, December 1980. And I go back and I said, well, who was speaking? Dr. Ben was the speaker. That's Joseph Ben Yochanan, and also the noted Pan-Africanist educator, Dr. Obert Chaga, former Black Panther, B. Kwaku Duran. I mean, there's a lot of people. And so I get recruited into the BSU. And then Nikki's like, okay, you're going to help with the Black History Month program. And we had like workshops. We had a play about Malcolm X. And there were two main speakers in the program. One was Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, who was speaking at the end of February 1981. And then before that, on February 18th, Queen Mother Moore. And I'm not joking. She's like, your job is to organize Queen Mother Moore's talk and introduce her. Now, granted, I'm not even 19 years old. And I'm like, I don't know what to do with myself. So, and I'm not going to tell the whole story, but basically, I meet Queen Mother Moore. I introduce her in 1981. And in those days, I think she must have been in her early 80s. She might have been 82 years old. And she could kick my behind. I mean, she was so dynamic. Little tiny, dressed in beautiful colors, and gave an amazing talk about reparations to only maybe 20 people. I did the best I could to get people there, but this is 1981. And so there was that world, but then we had study groups where, after Kwame Ture spoke, which blew me away. I've never, to this day, never heard a speaker as powerful as him. I was recruited into the All African People's Revolutionary Party study group on campus. And we were reading Kwame Nkrumah, Walter Rodney, T.L.R. James, W.B. Du Bois, Amilcar Cabral, and Kwame Ture, of course. But we were also reading, both independently and in study groups, Marx, Lenin, Mao Zedong. And I want to really emphasize this because right now, in the 21st century, people think of like Marxism and Black studies as somehow like separate pathways. And they were so integrated that no one was saying, oh man, Marx is a white man. I hadn't heard that until I became like a totally grown person surrounded by cultural nationalists. But, we were reading everything. And what I thought was really cool was, in addition to the AAPRP study group, which, by the way, had maybe 2 people in the group, I was part of another study group that was led by Mary Hoover. Mary Hoover is a name that everyone in Black studies should know. She was, at the time, a visiting professor. She came out of the Bay Area. She was very active in struggle in the Bay Area. She was close to Cedric Robinson, who at the time I didn't know of yet. I would find out later. And so she led a study group. And I remember we're reading Chinwezu, The West and the Rest of Us. I was reading either independently or in a study group, Samir Amin, Andre Gunter Frank, Mahmoud Bandani, Issa Shiji, Angela Davis, Manning Marable, Oliver Cox, all these different people who kind of operated in the intersection of dependency theory, Marxism, Black studies, and other things. And that was the education. And we applied that knowledge to our struggles in fighting the invasion of Grenada in 1983, the murder of Ron Settles, who was a Black man killed by the police, And then I ended up going to graduate school and getting involved in, a whole range of stuff. But one last thing. I know I talk way too much, but the person who had probably the largest impact, the writer, the scholar who had the largest impact on me at the time was Walter Rodney. And Walter Rodney, of course, had published How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He was assassinated, right? Just when I was beginning undergraduate. And what's interesting is that, I'm reading How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. That brought me to African studies. So my pathway to Black studies was through African studies. And I read, to be fair, I was reading everything else. Sheikh Anta Diop, hugely influential. Georgie M. James, Stolen Legacy, Chancellor Williams, the Destruction of Black Civilization. Those are the texts.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the periodization was ancient times to the present, and so, but Rodney shifted something in me, and I applied to UCLA to get a PhD in African history, to study essentially underdevelopment theory or underdevelopment theory, and I was going to write about groundnut production in Mozambique, and then somehow, some way, without getting into a lot of stuff, I ended up writing about the Communist Party, partly because I was a member of the Communist Workers' Party and wanted to know more about the intersection of Marxism and Black consciousness, and was writing about South Africa. But in 1985, 86, there's no way I was going to get to South Africa. So I ended up shifting fields to U.S. history, just like not on a whim, but because that made more sense. And by the way, I have the distinction of being the only PhD in U.S. history at UCLA to have only taken one U.S. history course. Because I petitioned to take the exam, the qualifying exam, and I passed it. And they couldn't believe it because I think 5 people took it and only 2 passed that year. And I was one because I was disciplined, right? And so I ended up teaching myself the U.S. history part of it. And then that's when it was being involved with a journal called Ufahamu, which was, to this day, the longest running graduate student journal in African studies, I think, in the world. I was the book review editor, and I was also the chair of the African Activists Association, which was the organization associated with the journal, for a year. And it was that time when I discovered Black Marxism, which had come out in 1983. And as book review editor, it just came in the mail. And I'm like, what is this? And I had to read it many times to figure out what was going on. And it really blew my mind and forced me in some ways to rethink my entire project. I didn't change the project. I was looking at communist movements and Black people, but in the South, U.S. South, but it did help me reorient the way I thought about things. And so all that foundational work in study groups, in reading deeply in Marxism, in reading Lenin, reading Antonio Gramsci, and reading Black studies, those things combined open up the path for me to do the work that I do now. And that's a long answer, but that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Well, thank you. That was amazing. I think that, well, one, your upbringing, like being in an environment where Black studies is just there and not even necessarily understanding what it is because you're a child, like a real child, like that. Yeah. That's phenomenal. But it also speaks to the importance of Black studies outside of academic walls, right? And having that influence, which, I mean, I can't necessarily imagine doing the kinds of readings that y'all were doing in undergrad as an independent like study group, right? Like we did some readings, but not that deep.
Right.
Um,
It's a really interesting thing. I think about study groups all the time because one, there's a generation that doesn't read the same way that we read. I can't even get students to read whole books anymore.
yeah.
And we were so hungry. In fact, we didn't have the digital access to anything. And by the way, as historian, I know we're going to talk about that. In those days, when you looked at newspapers, you looked at them on microfilm,
Yeah.
page by page by page, and you kind of had to find out what you. But to go back, without the digital access, we never had the luxury of targeting information. Like trying to capture information that we can then use, as if somehow books are information as opposed to portals of engagement, where we read cover to cover, and as we read, spoke together, talked together, thought together about what we're seeing, and the process of reading was transformative. And so for us, we didn't have money to buy books, so we went to this thing, I don't know, it's called the library. And the library was this cool place where you didn't have to pay for books, and this is a university library, so it was pretty well stocked for a state university. And we would go to the shelf. Well, I would go to the shelf and others, and there's certain areas that became our domain. E185.6, right? HX, which is the Marxist stuff. HD, labor. The African history. I mean, we go in the shelves, we're looking for one thing, and then notice next to that one thing is like 5 other things that are kind of interesting, and we would grab those. One. Number two, we didn't think of the classroom as a place of learning. We thought of the classroom as a place of contestation. And I have to say, I apologize to all my professors for sometimes our rudeness, because we would get up, and if you thought like the Spartacus or the Revolutionary Communist Party or ISO was like annoying at conferences when they get up and start giving speeches, we were worse. In our class, I'd stand up and we challenge our professors, we challenge the readings, because that's what we were told to do. That's what we figured out we had to do to learn. And if we're wrong half the time, then that half the time is probably the most productive time, because when you are on the wrong path and you get challenged, you have to find a way to get to the right path. And then we run back to the library for more books, And so books were like both our weapons, our sustenance, our way of maintaining community, because there's nothing like reading together in a group with an objective.
Yeah.
The idea was not to get an A on our paper. The idea was, okay, now that we've read this, how do we turn this into action? Again, it doesn't mean that we were right. It just meant that we had a different understanding what reading and study meant. It really did mean struggle,
I think that's so important, like the goal of turning the readings to action, like taking the theory and actually doing the practice, that I think is divorced from a lot of classrooms today and hard to get students to really see. Yeah. So that's thank you. That's a super important point. Building on that, so you talked about how you went to Long Beach. You had the minor in Black Studies, but ultimately you are a historian. You have multiple degrees in history. But you're also like, the work that you do is very much situated in and read deeply in Black studies. So how do you situate yourself disciplinarily?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I do think of myself as a historian, probably above all. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I think that's my primary intellectual, well, I should say it's like my primary academic identity. Um, and yet I also, like a lot of historians, we're a little bit chauvinistic. Like, well, history is the foundation of everything. Everyone will say that, and I think, for me, I have rarely found Black studies that did not have some kind of historical foundation to it.
Mm-hmm.
Even, the important work in anthropology and sociology is all kind of historical because we're always in motion.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, that's important. I also came up at a time in the 1980s when cultural studies was being born. Whether we attribute that to, the Birmingham School in England and Stuart Hall, or we attribute it to, other things. Um, the imperative for interdisciplinarity came from multiple angles. Black studies was already interdisciplinary. I mean, that was
Mm-hmm.
the definition. Um, uh, Certainly, women's studies was emerging, gender studies, which shaped my own thinking, but cultural studies did too. And so, cultural studies had the same imperative. It's like you read Stuart Hall and you read like um, uh, some of his early writings uh, about police violence in England, for example, and all that scholarship was intended to be turned into action,
Mm-hmm.
a critique of power relationships, so that you could really figure out a way to enter into those and disrupt those power relationships, and that culture became a really important kind of venue. So I ended up writing on not side, but I ended up writing about music. Um, Early on, my friend Trisha Rhodes, like my best friend coming up out of graduate school. We went to different schools, but we had the same fellowship. I learned a lot from her about the importance of hip hop, as a political uh, discourse and a cultural practice. I mean, she wrote the first
Mm-hmm.
serious scholarly study on hip hop, Black Noise, which, by the way, is having its anniversary edition coming out soon. Um, and you know that that shaped even my first book, because I had to go back and really think about, like, what is the culture of the Communist Party? What are the songs and the language and the pedagogy and the intergenerational transfer of knowledge? These are all cultural questions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I ended up writing about music, and I had another relationship to jazz, which is more personal. And so some people know me in like two different domains. Like, are you the Robin D.G. Kelley who wrote for the New York Times, who wrote Thelonious Monk? I said, but you're not the same one who did Hammer and Hoe. Like, who's that other guy? I'm like, no, it's the same person. So it's like it's a kind of bifurcated thing of writing about visual art and visual culture. I was not trained doing that work, but in some ways, Black studies was the pathway for me to take very seriously the art and cultural production by and about Black people. And so I had to take that work seriously. To take that seriously, and this is something else that Trisha and others have taught, I think, all of us, is that you got to take the aesthetic issue seriously.
Mm-hmm.
You can't, cultural studies is not just like Black studies around art, cannot be reading artistic production as a text in the same way that you'd read, say, the writings of Mariah Stewart or T. Thomas Fortune or W.B. Du Bois. You got to understand, like, what they're trying to do. They're trying to move the crowd, right,
Mm-hmm.
on the dance floor. That's one thing. That's not the same thing as saying, okay, well, you have this kind of critique of capital, and that may be embedded in there, but that's not the beginning or even the end.
Mm-hmm.
And so that that's part of my own sort of, you asked about disciplines. I feel like I end up through the back door, engaging in music studies, in a little bit of, critical art studies, in addition to everything else. So as a historian, um, I can't make those subgenre distinctions like
Mhm.
intellectual history, social history, political history. I use this term, which is not my own term, but kind of social history of politics. I wrote Hammer and Hoe. I think Victoria de Grazia coined that term. I can't remember, but the point is that um, the idea of the subgenre within disciplines, to me, I, I I feel like we all defy them, um, or we're all being forced into one of them or two of
Mhm.
them. And I think that they're false divisions. It's kind of like maybe it's not a good analogy, but for people who like jazz, it's like bebop is a term used for a particular kind of genre, but it really makes no sense because all the bebop musicians were playing all kinds of music all the time. And
Mhm.
so the genre becomes a commercial holding place to basically create borders and boundaries around musical practice, which in actuality had no did not resemble what people are actually doing. And I remember there was this great line where Duke Ellington says to Dizzy Gillespie, like, he's criticizing him and said, like, why'd you name this music bebop? He said, like, you shouldn't name it. And then he says, well, actually, if you're gonna name it, you should call it the Marcus Garvey extension, which I thought was genius. Like the Marcus Garvey, like bebop's the Marcus Garvey extension. See, that's Duke Ellington. And what he was also saying is that these genre distinctions are really for selling the product,
Yeah.
just like for our fields. When we start to have these kind of subgenre distinctions, we're trying to sell ourselves into the academy to say, well, this is our strength and this is what we do well, and this is you need an intellectual historian. I'm your person. And life, when you study human beings in the world, they never ever conform to the categories that we impose on them. You know,
Yeah.
so to me, the question of genre is bigger than the question of discipline is bigger than discipline. It's also about what are the lenses that we use to understand human experience and life experience within a world that is, androcentric, that centers um, on the human body as opposed to all other forms of life. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it made tons of sense. And I think it,
And
it speaks to like the nature of Black studies as being interdisciplinary. A lot of
Mhm.
the conversations that we have had on the podcast are about how no matter what somebody is specifically trained in disciplinarily, they're using multiple methods and multiple lens and they're drawing from all over the place to answer a set of questions that are interesting to them about Black life and culture and the future of Black people the world over. So it's not like the subgenres are too constraining and don't actually do anything but help to market which press you're going to do or what job
Right.
you apply to. So,
Exactly. I think that's exactly right.
so building on that, I want to ask how you would describe the evolution of Black studies from when you were a student to where it is now.
Yeah. I can't say everything because some things I'm jaded about. Um, uh, the evolution. It's a really great question, and it's funny. It's funny I'm hesitating because I actually wrote about this. We have this book that Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor and Colin Kaepernick and I did called "Our History Has Always Been Contraband,"
I
and
haven't.
in it, oh, you have that book, yeah. And you know, in it, we both Keeanga and I both give our versions, which really do correspond with one another, of the evolution of Black studies. Okay, so let me step back and let me say a couple things. One, I think there are multiple evolutions of Black studies. There is the evolution that begins with the texts of people like David Walker and Mariah Stewart in the early 19th century. In fact, go back to the 18th century. In other words, Black studies in some ways begins with the disruption of African life through the penetration of capital and violence. Because not to say that there wasn't studies before that, not to say there wasn't scholarship before that, in the production of knowledge, but just something about that moment in which the world becomes bigger by virtue of the scattering of our people, and the scattering of it as a process of violent disruption. And then what happens is people are not thrown into situations, and Fred Moten, who is really my hero, my longtime friend and teacher, makes this clear in the way that he draws on Edward Griswold's notion of, this kind of this consent to not accept one's position as a single being, but to be part of a kind of ontological totality, as Cedric Robinson would put it. So what does that mean? It means that Black studies comes out of that reflection, that meditation on what it means to suddenly be stripped of your life, but hold on to that life, to see the world through the lens produced in the world that you were stolen from, and still hold on to, and then see the rest of the world, not just Black people, but your enslavers, but your fellow workers, but the crew on the ship, to see them through the lens that you came out of. That is Black studies. And by the way, I was just reading, Justin Leroy has this new book that's coming out. I think it's called The Lowest Sort of Freedom. Beautiful book on racial capitalism and 19th century Black thinkers. That's coming out soon. But the point is that that's one source of the genealogy of Black studies, where suddenly, and Justin says, as many people said, Cedric Robinson, the thinkers of the 18th and 19th century are, even those people who are producing petitions during the American Revolution in North America, saying, based on the Declaration of Independence, I have a right to my freedom. Like those declarations, those petitions themselves are part of Black studies. And again, I'm only talking about North America. We haven't talked about the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa. All that stuff's happening at the same time. So that's one thing. I think a second moment of evolution for me, or genealogy, would be the 1930s. And some of my most important influences, everyone's most important influence, I mean, really, Du Bois, C.L.I. James, the 1930s was the moment in which fascism represented kind of, pivot point, where you have Black intellectuals looking at the future and the past simultaneously. Because what fascism represents is the culmination and intensification of what was centuries of anti-Black violence, centuries of forms of extraction, exploitation, which wasn't called fascism, but the structures of fascism themselves, coming out of dispossession, coming out of war, coming out of the degradation of non-white human beings. All that stuff comes to to a head in the 30s, because looking ahead, they're seeing that the revolutionary struggles against forms of fascism in the centuries before that can be the material, both the material, intellectual material, the strategic and tactical material, the vision of a different future that's decolonized. In other words, it's through fascism and through anti-fascism that the new world produced, where, not to, well, I guess I'll quote the Bible, but like where the bottom rail comes to the top, it's at that moment, that pivotal moment. And to me, it's a flowering of Black studies scholarship in the 30s, like really powerful. In the 30s, of course, the long 30s into the 40s and 50s, you got your St. Clair Drakes, you got your, all of these people are producing this work. And that generation of scholars taught, right, at universities like historically HBCU, Howard University in particular. They teach this generation of young people. Some of them are in classrooms taking classes with Sterling Brown, like Amiri Baraka and A.D. Spellman. Some of them are coming out of Birmingham, Alabama as kids and end up going to school in New York, like Angela Davis. I mean, there's all these different people who are of a particular generation, the post-war generation, being taught by that generation that was shaped by 1930s radicalism. They become the generation that's in SNCC, that forms the Black Panther Party, that forms the Black Arts Movement, that starts teaching Black people in their communities where they are. And that, to me, that moment is the flowering of what we think of as formal Black studies. People struggle to get inside these mainstream universities, and they win some of those struggles, and they start to try to transform them. And there's all kinds of reasons how that happens, which to me is not as important as what happened. And I should say one other thing is that when we talk about the evolution of Black studies, and this is something I learned reading Martha Biondi's work, is that we tend to look at the shiny objects, the universities. We tell the story over and over again about San Francisco State College, which became a university, and that's all true. I don't want to take the Third World Liberation Front, all that stuff. It's all true. But what she shows is that a lot of the struggles for Black studies were taking place in high school, in community college, places where you have a different class dimension in some ways, not entirely different, but where people are coming from places in which they can afford to have like buildings named after people, or they're doing work in the community because that's where they live. And the universities and the community colleges and the high schools don't have the space or resources to provide for them something that can incorporate them. So having said all that, that revolutionary insurgency, which I don't need to tell your listeners about, we know what happened. We know the politics and the movements that emerge out of that. It's what happens after that, which I think is worth thinking about. And that is how Black studies quickly becomes institutionalized. Even at UCLA, I've written about this, how it becomes not entirely, but there's a pressure to professionalize it, to the promise of having an institutional presence in our community gets thrown out for saying, okay, well, we're just as excellent as the econ department. Really? I mean, the fact that I even said that came out of my mouth, like, oh my God. And economics is one of those disciplines, with a few exceptions of people that I like and care about, is one of those disciplines that is like hoodwinks people.
Yeah.
It's like fake. They're economists get paid a lot of money to give us information to convince us that the class interest of the root class somehow is the interest of everybody else. And they still get the stuff wrong. Still, okay, that's neither here nor there. But the important thing is that the professionalization of Black studies in university settings ends up setting up its attack, setting up the attack against it. So on one hand, they begin to say, yeah, no, we're going to hire the best. We're going to, going to conform to academic norms and principles. And they grow in the 1970s, about 1974. Then they start to shrink. And they shrink because the very principles of evaluation that they're trying to conform with, and again, not everybody, but that some of the sort of mainstream Black studies kind of liberals are trying to conform to, they can't compete because they don't set the terms. So all of a sudden, university deans and presidents and stuff could say, you know what, you're not really up to par. You know what, these journals you're publishing in, they're not really peer reviewed in the sense. Journal of Black Studies, Callaloo, no, that's not good, that doesn't count. And then they start to cut and cut and cut and cut. And then those programs shrink by the late 70s. So what happens next? You get what I've written about called second wave Black studies and second wave ethnic studies, where the neoliberal moment of the early 1980s and late 70s, another generation is like, heck no, we are not going to accept this. We understand both the roots of the intellectual practice in social struggle, and we're going to have hunger strikes. We're going to block traffic. We're going to occupy the president's offices and chancellors and things like that. And they do that. And the 1980s, people sleep on it, represent a kind of resurgence of a kind of radical anti-neoliberal Black studies agenda, which then has to be fought back. Those students who came out, and it's like my generation in some ways was slightly, a little bit after that. These are students who were saying, we're going to take back Black studies for the people, even if that means standing up against faculty, inside these Black studies programs. And so that, to me, is this kind of second or maybe third or fourth or fifth wave, whatever you want to call it, of a kind of exciting development. But it's not a development that becomes hegemonic. It's not the dominant one. It's competing again with, and I won't name any names, but with professional departments that are really well endowed, that end up, promoting work that is kind of legitimizing a kind of liberal politics. And the rest of us, coming from a different perspective, are trying to do something quite different and maintain that relationship. I was fortunate enough. Well, first of all, I should say, I'm the luckiest person on the planet. I'm sorry. I apologize to you and everyone else, but in my life, I got to know and work with and befriend so many amazing people. And some people have been, I think unfairly, vilified for reasons that I can't understand. Right now, Cedric Robinson is one who is being attacked for reasons I can't understand, but that's another story. But I was close to Manning Marable. And I don't care what anyone said about Manning. People could disagree with his politics. They could disagree with his book on Malcolm X. Okay. Yeah, whatever. That's fine. But he has been a consistent, was always consistent proponent of a kind of left-oriented, Marxist-infused Black studies that's always tied to social struggle. Always. From when he was in Colorado, he recruited me to come to Columbia. And we did something. We had something there at Columbia with, Farrah Griffin and Manning and, so many people who were there at the time who were trying to do something different. And he kept alive that understanding of Black studies as a kind of institute with a community presence and a political commitment. And so he's just one of many examples of a different kind of tradition, even though he was at an Ivy League school, you know, uh, that, when we were fighting all kinds of battles all the time,
Mhm.
you know, both inside the university and outside, even the struggle against the university's expansion into Harlem, Columbia's expansion to Harlem, in West Harlem, and its displacement of people. It was faculty in Black studies more than anyone else, you know, who and Farrah Griffin especially, um, were like trying to battle these battles. And after Manning passed away, people still try to sustain that. I think about my friend Barbara Ransby, who I knew, who comes out of Black studies, also comes out of history. I was on her dissertation committee at University of Michigan. People don't know that. Years ago, years ago, before you were born, you know? And Barbara's one of those people who've always, like Manning, like others, and by the way, they're all together with Bill Fletcher and others, were the ones behind the Black Radical Congress, which has its own history. But people like Barbara, it's always seen the academy as both a site of struggle, but a site of resources to wage that struggle, because none of these people think that their destiny is to become a famous scholar. No, their destiny is tied to people and people's struggles to try to make this world a better place, which is the imperative of Black studies in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And there's many, many, many people like that. I don't want, if I start naming them, people get mad at me because I may forget somebody. But these are the people who I feel like I try to model my work after, and who represent, I think, the best of Black studies at a time when people thought Black studies had sold out.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes any sense.
No, it does. It does. And I have several questions. I want to ask, but I do want to be respectful of your time. So I want to ask a two-part question.
Mhm.
So one, what do you think of the potential of Black studies to provide an intellectual critique of U.S. empire, given where we are right now? But also, what do you think or feel is the vision or the future of Black studies? Like, where should we be going? Especially since
Right.
we are in a situation where there is a lot of overt critique and pushback and defunding
Mhm.
of Black studies in the academy itself.
Right. Well, I'll take the last first, which is that we've always dealt with defunding.
Yeah.
And part of that dealing with defunding has to do with, in some ways, our failure, just generally speaking, to develop an independent base. One of the amazing things about Black studies in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, was this attempt to try to build an independent intellectual base in places like Atlanta University with the Institute of the Black World, with the Communiversity in Chicago, where classes were taught in community centers and churches, and in using classroom space. Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's idea of the undercommon is also about not just taking from university resources, but creating independent spaces where we can do our work without having to be dependent. Of course, to be honest, that work continues to be done. It's just not done in degree granting institutions. Like, we know it. I've done millions of talks and study groups with critical resistance, and all these different groups, they exist. They keep doing the work. So I feel like as long as those movements exist, and as long as study becomes a very important component of that, Black studies will be there. They could destroy every single department in this country, and it's still going to be there. And if it's not there, it's our failure to step outside. Okay. To go back to so the first question is not really about the future, but it was about, what was the first part of the question? Remind me. It wasn't so much the
What
future.
do you think is the potential of Black
The
studies?
potential, yeah. Potential and future. Right. So, an empire. That was a really important part of it. So I've been thinking about that. Black studies has always had to be insistently anti-imperialist, and that's how it emerges. In fact, I didn't mention this, though I do mention it in my piece on second wave ethnic studies. Anti-imperialism was the ground in which ethnic studies and Black studies emerged. You know, it was against the Vietnam War. It was against the Portuguese colonial wars in Mozambique and Bissau and Angola. It was against the apartheid regimes, which are colonial regimes, just to be clear. It was, and so, like some of the texts I mentioned that we're reading, Samir Amin, Andre Gunther Frank, Walter Rodney, Chin Weizhu, these were anti-imperialist texts for sure. These were texts about the way neocolonialism was functioning in Africa and the Caribbean and elsewhere. And what are the responses to that? How is it that economies in what we call the third world, how they were linked to and fueled the first world, neoliberal capitalist order, right? So it's necessarily, and this is the thing that disturbs me, is that if I could, and I'm not on social media, but if I could like read something and see something in which you have all these Black people saying things like, well, ICE attacks on immigrants, that's not my struggle. That's not my fight. Like, we failed as Black studies. We completely failed. When people say, well, you know what, I can't be in solidarity with Palestine because, anti-Blackness is everywhere, and so therefore there's no basis for solidarity with anyone, we fail. We failed analytically, we failed in terms of our understanding of history, and we failed politically. And so so it's imperative. In other words, we cannot have a Black studies that's not anti-imperialist. We can't have a Black studies that has no critique of empire, because that's the grounds in which we operate. That's exactly why that's our raison d'etre, right? That's why we call it Black studies. And by the way, you know this fight. People trying to change African American studies to Black studies, and what does that mean? And my daughter and I talk about this all the time. And the hold of African American studies, which is curious to me, is tied to a different kind of trend. Some of it is tied to the idea that we really are Americans, whatever that means, right?
Yeah.
And therefore, that should be our sole focus. As if somehow you can't do two things at once. Like, that is, recognize the specific context in which we operate within North America, which is kind of the belly of the beast, and know the ties to and understand the struggles of Black people around the globe. Like I said, I came up in Black studies when no one ever questioned that divide. Like, I don't remember anyone saying, oh yeah, we need to call ourselves African American studies. The only reason to do that is which was a big thing in the 1980s and 70s, that is to recognize a national or continental relationship to our roots, to say Africa. And then we came up with all kinds of other things, Africana studies, was Cornell University, ways to basically move from color to place. But as we also learn in Black studies, Black is not just color; it's a political identity, you know. And when we recognize that, then we're not going to be, wringing our hands about should we be African American or should we be Black. Um, in terms of the potential, I remember my dear friend, my sister Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and I, when we were both at USC, and she was chair of American Studies and Ethnicity, and we had this meeting, and we are talking about like we're going to change the name, and the name that was circulating among us, I remember Ruthie and I, at least, I can't remember if anyone else went for this, was liberation study. And so we'll go from noun to verb, you know, like what are we really doing here? And it was like so great because it was a reminder that we have a task at hand, and where everyone's fighting about African American versus Black versus Africana versus blah blah blah, and we're like, no, we're liberation studies because that's what we're trying to do. And I think that is the potential. And so to me, there's something constructive about the debate, even though I do like Black studies. And I'm not ever going to say, oh, we have to settle it. I'm saying the debate tells us something about where we're thinking ideologically, where we're thinking politically. So I think that's really important. I also know that the professionalization of the academy itself has really done a number on not just Black studies, but on all disciplines in the academy itself. I got a whole generation of young scholars who are being told they have to professionalize, and they start to do things like, okay, well, I gotta have a website, and I gotta have agents, I gotta protect my brand, I've got to do social media in certain kind of way to elevate my profile, and they end up falling into the neoliberal trap of seeing themselves as like little miniature capitals as opposed to being in struggle. And one of the things that I think is important about the work that we do, speak of potential, is that, to be in a study group, to go back to that, is also to produce a body of work that was never, ever intended to be circulated. We wrote position papers. Position papers were to be circulated among our group to kind of thrash out contradictions and work out ideas, not for likes. No one's gonna post that stuff. I got all kinds of papers that no one's ever seen before except for my circle that's in my file. And when I die one day, people could look at them if they want to. But then why? They read about various critiques that and we were writing stuff that didn't have authors. No one cared about getting credit for that. But how do we resist? How could the potential of Black studies be unfurled or be realized when we're also up against a neoliberal culture in the academy that pays more attention to career, right, than consciousness? Pays more attention to upward mobility than those who are facing downward mobility. And that's, to me, that's the imperative. It's not even about doing something like reinventing the wheel. It's about kind of going back and remembering and recovering what brought us here in the first place, And that has been my whole I've been in this business for 40 years. And in those 40 years, that has been the number one thing for me and for my comrades, right? And I hope that it's going to be the number one thing for the next generation, because if it isn't, and I'll be honest about this, this may be the last thing people will quote from me. If Black studies cannot return to that imperative to struggle, right, and to struggle from a place of love, then we don't need it. Y'all could have it. I mean, they could have it if they want to. If you want to be like famous, be famous. Want to be famous in the name of Black studies? Whatever. We'll come up with something else. you know, because the struggle is going to continue no matter what, especially now as we face both an authoritarian right wing turn on a global scale, a recolonization, you know,
Mhm.
uh, the age of decolonization is over. We're seeing a reversal of that. A massive rise of of imperial aggression, unlike anything we've seen in the last at least 30 or 40 years. Um, we've got to stand up against that because it's not the discipline and it's survival that matters. It's the survival of the planet and all the people who are being killed in the streets, whether we're talking about Venezuela or Lagos, um, or in Sudan or in Port-au-Prince, or in Palestine. I mean, this is what we have to struggle with,
Mhm.
or in right here in Los Angeles. I don't know if that
Thank
answers the question.
that does. Um, it more than answered the question. So thank you very, very, very much. Thank you so much for your time today and the generosity of your answer. Is there anything you would like to add or end on?
Yes, yes. The thing I want to really add, because I know one of the things that you wanted me to talk about, and I'll be very quick, was just about the future
Mhm.
of Black studies. And as much as I'm a little bit skeptical about the professionalization issues, there are people. There's some developments that I think are so exciting. And I just name a couple. I think Black geographies, abolition geography,
Mhm.
is a trend in Black studies that is essential. I mean, I mentioned Ruth Wilson Gilmore, the late Clyde Wood, Catherine McKittrick, Simone Brown. There's a whole new generation of people who do Black geographies or Black ecology. J.T. Rowan, Jovan Scott Lewis, Brandy Summers, Latoya Eves. I got two amazing colleagues here at UCLA, Ayasha Garin, Kylie Heights. But the person I want to mention above all in this field is a Yale professor named Elizad Kelley. Full disclosure, she is my daughter, you know. But she has this amazing book coming out called Flight Lines, A Poetic to Black Space with Duke University. Um, and there are so many people who I think are just moving us in so many amazing directions. Elizad being one of them, uh, Orisami Burton, who published Tip of the Spear, just brilliant. Savannah Shange, who wrote Progressive Dystopia. There's James Gordon Williams, Shauna Redmond, Sarah Haley, Cisco Bradley, and I mentioned Justin Leroy's new book. I mean, there's so many people, and of course, my dear friend, one of the most brilliant thinkers on the planet, Panache Chigubanzi, who has moved Black studies in a whole different direction. And I really want to uplift them. And I know I'm known for trying to hold up the names of younger scholars coming up, and that's what I do because they're way smarter than I could ever be. But I just want your listeners to kind of follow up with this stuff with Jarvis McInnes and people like that who, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. We're doing amazing stuff. We're not going for the okie doke, as they say. Um, we're not trying to make a name for themselves, but producing just amazing, amazing work that is advancing in ways that actually go way beyond the imaginations of my peers and teachers back in the early 1980s. So I'm excited about what's going on. We just have to make sure that whatever's going on, that there is above all a movement, a movement that continues to fight for the liberation of our people and all people, because that's why I even got into this gig in the first place.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you so much again. Greatly appreciate your time and all of your insight and answers. So,
Yeah, well, thank you, Ashley. I really appreciate it. I'm so glad because now I feel like I've arrived. You know, I'm on the Black Studies podcast, so I'm good.
okay, sure. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Ashley. I'll see you.
Okay, bye.